Blog Talk
Blog
Radio.
Talk Radio.
This is BR on the World on the 17th of November 2014. Bostonred here. This is our international program. It is slanted towards international events that affect the world that you live in. This is part of the Bostonred network as we put together our our family of programs. We try to focus on the political, that is Bostonred, the economic, numbers man, the world of open source, the open source movement, Linux, etc., security, called the Open Source Report. So our objective here is to bring all three together and, as the business people would say, form a synergy. We have distressing news out of the Syrian theater, I guess we'll call it that, but Abdul Rahman Kisik has been killed by the organization ISIS that call themselves Islamic State. Let's just, in front from the BBC, we'll hear from his pants.
Greater love hath no man than this, than to lay down his life for another. A while ago we were informed that our beloved son, Abdul Rahman, no longer walks this earth. Our hearts, though heavy, are held up by the love and support that has poured into our lives these last few days.
One of Abdul Rahman's teacher, the mother of some of his friends, wrote before his slaying, "If a person can be both a realist and an idealist, then that's Peter. Peter has earned the right to be both. In 26 years, he has witnessed and experienced firsthand more of the harsh realities of life than most of us can imagine. But rather than letting the darkness overwhelm him, he has chosen to believe in the good, in himself and in others. Peter's life is evidence that he has been right all along. One person makes a difference. Our hearts are battered, but they will mend. The world is broken, but it will be healed in the end. And good will prevail as the one God of many names will prevail."
Please pray for Abdul Rahman, or Pete, if that's how you know him, at sunset this evening. Pray also for all people in Syria, in Iraq, and around the world that are held against their will. And lastly, please allow our small family the time and privacy to mourn, cry, and yes, forgive, and begin to heal.
That was the father of Abdul Rahman Kisik, murdered the Islamic State. We'll go now to the U.S., where another murder is being addressed in the city of Ferguson, Missouri. The headline there is the governor in the state of Missouri has declared a state of emergency there in Missouri. Jay Nixon, known as Jay Dixon Nixon, said the Guard will support the local law enforcement panel deciding whether to charge the Darrell Wilson. He was the officer that murdered Mike Brown. That is not in dispute. It's the manner in which he, for the circumstances, I should say, in which he performed the murder. The prosecution is being orchestrated by the prosecutor in St. Louis County, not to be confused with the city of St. Louis. Mr. Brown had his hands up and was executed. The emergency order signed us activating the Missouri Guard as part of our ongoing effort to plan and prepare for any contingency. It's necessary to have these resources in place in advance of the announcement. The order also puts the St. Louis County Police Department in charge of policing the protesters. This is a law enforcement answer here, and the Ferguson Police Department not. They had already announced they would be under a unified command in the city of Ferguson there. Thus, as far as the police department in Ferguson is concerned, they are more or less not in the, as they say, immediate vicinity there. A totally different situation in the city of St. Louis, and that whole area. They have decided that they would not have the Ferguson police and their maligned chief taking any part in this particular situation. So since the declaration there that puts further emphasis on it, we had assumed that they would in fact move in this particular direction here. Now, this is from one of the mayors in the St. Louis area. See if we can get this report in here.
Good afternoon from the Fox 2 Newsroom. We have some breaking news here. Within the past hour, Missouri Governor Jay Nixon has signed a state of emergency, which would in effect activate the National Guard ahead of the grand jury decision coming down in the Michael Brown case. We're going to take you live now to St. Louis City Hall, where Mayor Francis Slay is discussing this executive order and the National Guard being activated with the media.
Now, this report is coming from the city of St. Louis, Missouri.
We're waiting for board to set up. Yeah. You ready to? Oh.
All right, are we ready to go? All right, well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. First of all, I just wanted to make sure that, well, I know the governor announced that he will be deploying the National Guard in the coming days in anticipation of a decision by the grand jury out in Clayton. And I wanted to make sure that you all had an idea of what, the way we viewed this was going to happen and what would happen with these guardsmen in the city of St. Louis. So how would we deploy them in the city of St. Louis? And this would be, they would be deployed on, we don't know how many we're going to get yet, and we don't know exactly when they're going to be deployed, but we'll be finding that out very shortly. I wanted to make sure you knew what that would look like. This would be, from our standpoint, a secondary role. We would not have the Guard, you know, on the front lines, interacting with, dealing with, confronting protesters. They would be used for three different approaches. One would be visibility, deterrence, and then the other early warning. So they would be stationed at various locations within the city of St. Louis, shopping centers, strip centers where you have shopping, maybe some specific buildings like government buildings and those sort. They'd always be accompanied by St. Louis police officer as well. So they would not be, as I said, they'd not be on the front lines dealing with protesters under any circumstance except if it was some kind of a major issue came up where they were needed. But to keep in mind, they're going to be here just for kind of backup, backfill, and to protect various locations in the city of St. Louis. And the other thing is we have our police officers are going to be deployed and have been deployed for quite some time. Over the past several weeks, they've been running 12-hour shifts for some time, so they are tired, and we'll be welcoming this backup support, by the way. But as I said, the Guard will not be used on the front lines. They will not be interacting with protesters. They will be used in a secondary role and be accompanied by a St. Louis police officer where they are, and will be stationed at various locations determined by the chief of police for security purposes.
They will be armed, though, won't they?
That is my understanding, that they will be armed, and how they will be armed I'm not aware of yet.
And the protesters were kind of asking that the police lay back a little, not to confront them. Could this move possibly incite them and make them more fearful and
touch off something as opposed to what you're trying to?
Well, one of the things the reason I'm here talking to you today is to let you know that, again, the way we view this, the Guard is not going to be confronting the protesters and will not be on the front line, interacting directly with the demonstrators. It's going to be our police officers in the city of St. Louis. Of course, St. Louis County is going to be taking care of St. Louis County, and St. Louis City is going to be taking care of St. Louis. So our police officers in the city of St. Louis will be wearing their police officer uniforms. They're not going to be having, the riot gear on and things like that, unless, of course, a situation would occur which would require them to do that to protect themselves.
And Mr. Mayor, when the decision comes out, assuming it might be one that the people don't like who are protesting, what is your advice to your constituents, to the city residents? Should they treat this like a snow day and stay at home to see how it goes? Or is it business as usual? What's your advice for people to stay safe?
Well, at this point, basically, we're asking people to, and everybody's going to have to make their own decision from their own standpoint, whether, what schools are going to do, what businesses are going to do. But basically, our advice is to, go about business as usual. And we don't know when this decision is going to come out or how it's going to be announced. But certainly, as we get closer to that day, we may have a different view on exactly what should happen. But at this point, we do not want people to feel like they have to, panic or be afraid at this point. But we want everybody to know that we're doing everything we can in our power, first of all, to make sure that people and their property are going to be safe and that the protesters can protest peaceably and can protest freely in a fashion that they like to do, as long as they're nonviolent. Yep.
That was the mayor of St. Louis, Mayor Slay, addressing a news conference there in the city of St. Louis. Now, we have a reaction here from the parents of the late Michael Brown reacting to police radio calls from the day, that their son Michael Brown was shot. They were obtained by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Now, there was a question there, was this igniting the situation, in other words, bringing in the National Guard? In our opinion, it's a situation that the protesters have said that this is the ones that will be involved in civil disobedience, etc. They will take a very pragmatic approach to what is going on. In other words, they will wait and see. If there is a blow-up or a rebellion there, they will wait on their activities, and they will start later in the cycle. So let's just hear a little bit of this.
Attorneys for Michael Brown's parents are reacting to police radio calls the day Michael Brown was shot and killed by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson.
Fox News' Betsy Bruce joins us with more on the radio dispatch recordings obtained by our partners at the Post-Dispatch. Betsy.
Elliot and Shirley, now the story in tomorrow, Sunday morning's Post-Dispatch, offers a more detailed look at the August 9th encounter between Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson and Michael Brown, Jr. But it has not changed the Brown family's opinion about how the Ferguson Police Department responded on that fateful day. Mike Brown Jr.'s parents returned to St. Louis Friday night before they or their lawyers were aware the St. Louis Post-Dispatch had released Ferguson police radio calls and surveillance video of Officer Darren Wilson, who fired the fatal shots. Here you can see Officer Wilson in a T-shirt heading to the hospital 2 hours after Brown died in the middle of the street. Today, the family's attorneys noted, quote, from the video released today, it would appear the initial descriptions of his, Officer Wilson's, injuries were exaggerated. The Post-Dispatch sought Ferguson police calls from August 9th under Missouri's Sunshine Law. You can hear descriptions of a suspect wanted for a stealing at the Ferguson Market on West Florissant. Within a few minutes, the search for two suspects is focused on Canfield Drive, where Wilson arrived first. Post-Dispatch reporter Robert Patrick.
We have reported on a source basis that he didn't immediately recognize these guys as the suspects that everybody was looking for when he first encountered them. It wasn't until after Mike Brown walked by with the Swisher Sweet cigars in his hand that he puts two and two together, and that's when he makes that radio call.
21, put me on Canfield with 2 and send me to our car.
41 seconds later, Ferguson Police Unit 25 arrived on the scene, followed by Unit 22.
25, I'm going out on Canfield. 22's out.
At 12:07 p.m., 5 minutes after Officer Wilson's initial call, we hear this.
Get us several more units over here. There's going to be a problem.
The Brown family attorneys reacted saying, quote, the audio clearly demonstrates that the initial interaction with the officer and Brown had nothing to do with the incident at the convenience store. The recorded radio traffic does not include Wilson announcing the fact that shots were fired. The Post has reported that Wilson told authorities his radio was jarred as he and Brown struggled and the channel was changed. Now, to read this story, you can pick up a copy of the Sunday Morning Post-Dispatch. You can also check out the audio and the surveillance.
Nonetheless, have President Obama, sorry, my mic was off, but in Japan, again, they are in a recession in Japan. We will hear from President Obama at the conference there in Australia, and his comments on ISIS, on immigration in the U.S., and on several other things. He gave about a 20-minute news conference. We'll have to edit it here, but nonetheless, this will be it. This is Bostonred for BR on the World on the 17th of November 2014. We'll be talking to you at a much more regular pace in the next coming days and weeks. Good evening.
Held repeatedly by this Supreme Court for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, to be able to shape rules to regulate the emission of greenhouse gases. Obviously, it's supplemented by a bunch of stuff that we're doing that nobody suggests isn't within our authority. For example, the doubling of fuel efficiency standards on cars is something that we negotiated with the car companies and with labor groups, and is working really well, and we're selling a lot of American cars domestically as well as internationally, and they're more fuel-efficient cars and, as a consequence, more popular cars. With respect to executive actions generally, the record will show that I have actually taken fewer executive actions than my predecessors. Nobody disputes that. What I think has changed is the reaction of some of my friends in Congress to exercising what are normal and, frankly, fairly typical exercises of presidential authority. You are absolutely right that the very nature of an executive action means that a future president could reverse those actions. But that's always been true. That was true when I came into office. If President Bush had a bunch of executive actions that he had signed, it was part of my authority to reverse them. That's why, for example, on immigration reform, it continues to be my great preference to see Congress pass comprehensive legislation, because that is not reversed by a future president. It would have to be reversed by a future Congress. That's part of the reason why I've argued consistently that we're better off if we can get a comprehensive deal through Congress. That's why I showed extraordinary patience with Congress in trying to work a bipartisan deal. That's why I was so encouraged when the Senate produced a bipartisan immigration deal, and why I waited for over a year for Speaker Boehner to call that bipartisan bill in the House. But as I've said before, I can't wait in perpetuity when I have authorities that, at least for the next 2 years, can improve the system, can allow us to shift more resources to the border rather than separating families, improve the legal immigration system. I would be derelict in my duties if I did not try to improve a system that everybody acknowledges is broken. And with respect to Syria, Chairman Dempsey, I think, has consistently said in all his testimony, and I would expect him to always do this, to give me his best military advice and to not be constrained by politics. And he has not advised me that I should be sending U.S. troops to fight. What he said in testimony, and what I suspect he'll always say, is that, yes, there are circumstances in which he could envision the deployment of U.S. troops. That's true everywhere, by the way. That's his job, is to think about various contingencies. And yes, there are always circumstances in which the United States might need to deploy U.S. ground troops. If we discovered that ISIL had gotten possession of a nuclear weapon and we had to run an operation to get it out of their hands, then yes, you can anticipate that not only would Chairman Dempsey recommend me sending U.S. ground troops to get that weapon out of their hands, but I would order it. So the question just ends up being, what are those circumstances? I'm not going to speculate on those. Right now, we're moving forward in conjunction with outstanding allies like Australia in training Iraqi security forces to do their job on the ground. My thinking has not changed currently. Ed Henry of Fox.
Thank you. One question, I promise.
That's great.
All right. At your Burma town hall a couple of days ago, you tried to inspire young leaders by saying governments need to be held accountable and be responsive to the people. I wonder how you square that with your former advisor, Jonathan Gruber, claiming you were not transparent about the health law because, in his words, the American people, the voters, are stupid. Did you mislead Americans about the taxes, about keeping your plan, in order to get the bill passed?
No, I did not. I just heard about this. I get well briefed before I come out here. The fact that some advisor who never worked on our staff expressed an opinion that I completely disagree with in terms of the voters is no reflection on the actual process that was run. We had a year-long debate, Ed. I mean, go back and look at your stories. The one thing we can't say is that we did not have a lengthy debate about health care in the United States of America, or that it was not adequately covered. I mean, I would just advise every press outlet here, go back and pull up every clip, every story, and I think it's fair to say that there was not a provision in the health care law that was not extensively debated and was fully transparent. Now, there were folks who disagreed with some of these various positions. It was a tough debate. But the good news is, and I know this wasn't part of your question, but since some folks back home who don't have health insurance may be watching, open enrollment just started, which means that those who did not take advantage of the marketplaces the first time around, they've got another chance to sign up for affordable health care. They may be eligible for a tax credit. So far, there were over 500,000 successful logins on the first day. Healthcare.gov works really well now. 1.2 million people used the window shopping function since Sunday. There were 23,000 applications completed in just the first 8 hours and tens of thousands more throughout the day. Healthcare is working. More than 10 million people have already gotten health insurance. Millions more are eligible. And contrary to some of the predictions of the naysayers, not only is the program working, but we've actually seen healthcare inflation lower than it's been 50 years, which is contributing to us reducing the deficit and has the effect of making premiums for families lower than they otherwise would have been if they have health insurance. All right? Kristen Welker.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to ask you again about Syria. When you were recently asked about the U.S. campaign...
The continuing resolution expires on December 11th. Mm-hmm. Many things you've talked about on this trip are related to that, funding for coalition operations in Iraq and Syria, the Ebola outbreak, not to mention day-to-day government operations. What are the odds the country will see itself in a shutdown scenario? How much do you fear the government will shut down, and to what degree does your anxiety about this or your team's anxiety about this influence the timing of your decision on immigration and executive action?
I take Mitch McConnell at his word when he says that the government's not going to shut down. There's no reason for it to shut down. We traveled down that path before. It was bad for the country. It was bad for every elected official in Washington. And at the end of the day, it was resolved in the same way that it would have been resolved if we hadn't shut the government down. So that's not going to be productive. And I think that Leader McConnell and Speaker Boehner understand that. But this goes to a broader point that I've made previously, and I'll just reiterate. It is in the nature of democracy that the parties are going to disagree on certain issues. And in our system, because we don't have a parliamentary system, it means that you can have a Congress of one party and a president of another, and they disagree on some really fundamental issues. And the question then is, how do you deal with that? Well, the sensible way to deal with it is to say, here are the issues we don't agree on, and we'll fight like heck for our position, and then we'll work together on the issues that we do agree on. And that's how it's always been. That's how it was with Ronald Reagan when he was... We're going to close with Jim Avila.
Thank you, Mr. President. Following up on immigration, in 2010, when asked by immigration reform advocates to stop deportations and act alone on providing legal status for the undocumented, you said, quote, "I'm president, I'm not king. I can't do these things just by myself."
Right.
In 2013, you said, "I'm not the emperor of the United States. My job is to execute laws that are passed." Mr. President, what has changed since then? And since you've now had a chance to talk since July with your legal advisors,
right,
what do you now believe are your limits so that you can continue to act as president and not as emperor or king?
Well, actually my position hasn't changed. When I was talking to the advocates, their interest was in me, through executive action, duplicating the legislation that was stalled in Congress. And getting a comprehensive deal of the sort that is in the Senate legislation, for example, does extend beyond my legal authorities. There are certain things I cannot do. There are certain limits to what falls within the realm of prosecutorial discretion in terms of how we apply existing immigration laws. And what we've continued to do is to talk to Office of Legal Counsel that's responsible for telling us what the rules are, what the scope of our operations are, and determining where it is appropriate for us to say, we're not going to deport 11 million people. On the other hand, we've got severe resource constraints right now at the border, not in apprehending people, but in processing and having enough immigration judges and so forth. And so what's within our authority to do in reallocating resources and reprioritizing, since we can't do everything. And it's on that basis that I'll be making a decision about any executive actions that I might take. I will repeat what I've said before. There is a very simple solution to this perception that somehow I'm exercising too much executive authority. Pass a bill I can sign on this issue. If Congress passes a law that solves our border problems, improves our legal immigration system, and provides a pathway for the 11 million people who are here, working in our kitchens, working in farms, making beds in hotels. Everybody knows they're there. We're not going to deport all of them. We'd like to see them being able, out in the open, to pay their taxes, pay a penalty, get right with the law. Give me a bill that addresses those issues. I'll be the first one to sign it, and metaphorically, I'll crumple up whatever executive actions that we take, and we'll toss them in the wastebasket, because we will now have a law that addresses these issues.
But in those 5 months, sir, since you said you were going to act, have you received the legal advice from the Attorney General about what limits you have and what you can do?
Yes.
And would you tell us what those are?
No. I will tell them when I make the announcement. But it's a good try, though. It was a good angle. Jim and I go way back. Although he was famous, I was not. He used to be a broadcaster in Chicago, so I used to watch him on TV. You've aged a little better than I have. Yeah. All right, people of Australia, thank you again for your wonderful hospitality.